Hey y'all, welcome back. It is Taji with Melanated Maker DIY, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how I turned this kind of cheap, kind of messy dresser that I got on Facebook Marketplace for $30 into a beautiful apothecary cabinet for my home office. If you remember from last week's video, I have been working on my home office and trying to just give myself a more organized and more beautiful space. So if you haven't seen last week's video where I installed new closet shelving, I will include that down below. But this is going to be a really fun project. I'm really excited to share it with you guys, so let's get into it. So the first thing that I wanted to do is replace how these drawers slide. And so I started with these bottom mount drawers, and I honestly thought I could just install them to replace the wooden drawer slide that the dresser already had. So I cut and installed a support piece to mount inside the dresser to be able to attach these new drawer slides to, and it just was not working out. I honestly later figured out that I was using the drawer slide all wrong, but was honestly happy with the chance to rework the drawers and add even better hardware. To do this, I was going to need to add inner supports to the dresser to attach the new hardware to. I cut some pieces of 1x3 lumber and drilled pocket holes into them to attach it to the dresser. I made sure to cut them just about a 1/16 of an inch too long so that they fit extra snug in place and made it much easier to install. So here I am just using a mallet to knock these into place. Having them snug was so helpful in just being able to have them stay in place by themselves, so that way I could just drill them in without also having to hold them at the same time. Once the supports were in, I used a scrap board to lift the new drawer slides and ensure they were level with the dresser before I installed them. Honestly, I was really nervous about doing this since I've never installed drawer slides before, but it was actually really easy. I watched a few YouTube videos ahead of time to feel more comfortable, but I was definitely overhyping it in my head. This was just another reminder that you never know what you're capable of until you just start doing it. So you can see here, I just easily attached one screw in the front and one in the back. Because the previous drawers were built for that bottom wooden track, they weren't the proper size to install side mount slides to. So I decided to take on another new challenge and build all new drawer boxes for the dresser. I'll go over the steps that I took to build these, but I watched Michael Alm's video on building drawer boxes a few different times before this, and he had the best explanation for me to be able to pick it up and apply it to what I was doing. I definitely recommend checking out his video if you're going to build any kind of drawers, so I'll be sure to leave a link to it in the description below. So for building these drawers, I first used my table saw and ripped down some 3/4 inch plywood to the depth of the drawer, which I wanted to be about 6 inches. Then I used my miter saw to cut 12 boards to be the depth of the drawer, which was 14 inches. I cut 12 boards since there were 6 drawers and 2 sides per drawer, which gave me 12 boards that I needed to cut. I also cut 12 front and back pieces to be 21 inches long. This is where Michael Alm's video really comes in handy, because when you're thinking about the width of the drawer, you also have to take into account the size of the wood that you're using, which was 3/4 of an inch, as well as taking into account the slide hardware, which is about another inch. Then you throw in at least a 1/16 of an inch to make sure you've got some room so that the drawers don't fit too tightly and end up binding. But like I said, I included Michael Alm's video down below, so make sure you check it out. He explains it so clearly, I just don't know if I'm doing it justice. I then drilled pocket holes into all of my back and front pieces to attach them to the sides and started assembling them. I used a speed square for each drawer to make sure it was perfectly square, because the last thing you want is a crooked drawer, which is a whole different set of potential issues when building, obviously. I cut out the bottom of the drawer using 1/2 inch plywood and glued and nailed them into each drawer. Lastly, I caulked all the seams of the drawer boxes, which was purely aesthetic to make it just feel that much more cohesive. I ran a bead of caulk along each seam and then smoothed it out with my finger. I then started prepping for paint and sanded this whole cabinet using 120 grit sandpaper and then following it up with 180 grit sandpaper. That way I could make sure that the cabinet was nice and scuffed up to allow the paint to adhere to it. Next, I started on building the cubbies that I would be adding to the top of this Apothecary cabinet. On this ridiculously windy day, I used my table saw to rip down some more 3/4 inch plywood. I then cut down one long piece to run the back of the cabinet and 3 more pieces to be the sides and the center. For the centerpiece of the cubby, I traced out exactly where it would sit to make sure that it was center, so as I was installing it later on, I wasn't having to play around and figure out exactly where it needed to go. Doing this ahead of time made it a lot easier to install, so I definitely recommend it. I drilled pocket holes into all of them as my choice of joinery, that way I could hide any screws or nails to make it appear more like this whole cabinet had always been built like this. I did mess up some pocket holes, so remember that when doing opposing sides, you need a mirrored image and not a replica. Because the cubby is small, I just flipped it and added more pocket holes and it's totally unnoticeable. So I drilled in one of the screws to anchor the side piece down to the dresser. Then I held it in place with a clamp to make sure that all of the sides were square before I drill in the rest of the screws. Once I figured that out, I started to drill in all of the other screws, and since I'm using 3/4 inch plywood for the sides, I used 1 1/4 inch Craig pocket screws. Once I got the sides screwed in, I then screwed it down to the top of the dresser. So I've realized that to do the doors for this, they're gonna need to sit in this corner. But now the hinges are in the way. All of the hinges are in the way. So I'm gonna have to come back in here and move all 12 of the inches, all 12 of the inches, all 12 of the hinges back like a half an inch. I don't want to scream and I don't want to cry, so I'm just gonna get to work. That's all you can do. Positivity here. Okay. So I took the slide off and marked for the depth of the drawer front, which will be 1/2 of an inch. Then I marked it so that I knew how far back to move the slides before reattaching it. And then I did that 5 more times. To attach the drawers to the slide, I used a scrap piece of plywood as a stop to make sure that the slides were aligned with the front of the drawer box. Once I got it lined up, I attached 2 screws on each side, one in the front and one in the back, and then I did that 5 more times as well. To get the Apothecary cabinet appearance, I lowered the blade on my table saw to about 1/8 of an inch and ran 1/2 inch pieces of plywood over the top to make the 1 drawer appear as 3 drawers. I cut the cubby doors from 3/4 inch plywood and checked the fit. You want to leave about 1/8 of an inch on both sides to make sure that there's room for the door to properly open and shut without rubbing against other pieces. That'll cause a lot of wear and tear really quickly, so it definitely took a couple of tries just to make sure that I was going to have it fit nicely but not too snug and not too loose. I then attached the hinges and nailed in some scrap pieces of wood as a blocker so that the doors sat flush and didn't sit too far back. To finish up the cubbies, I installed these undermount drawers inside, and because the hinges for the door are a bit wide, I made sure to push the undermounts to the back of the cubby area. I decided to use these undermounts for a sliding tray, that way the items are more accessible in the cubby and I can increase the storage capacity. This little cubby is one of my favorite parts of this whole project. To build the cubby, I just took some 3/4 inch plywood and ripped it down to be just 1 inch less than the width of the cubby space. That way I would have some room for my drawer hardware, and it didn't have to be perfect since it was only going to be a tray, so that worked out really, really nicely. I pre-drilled some holes and then inserted the screws, and this was honestly one of the easier parts of the project, and it made such a huge impact to be able to add this to the cubby. So I just primed and then I painted it. If only it were that easy. I started with 2 coats of primer, lightly sanding between each coat with a 220 grit sanding paper, and then with the tiniest little paintbrush, I painted all the little grooves on the drawer fronts. Then, using a foam roller, I painted on 2 coats of Sherwin Handsome Plum paint, also lightly sanding between coats. After all of that, I then attached the drawer boxes again and pre-drilled some holes inside for when I need to attach the drawer fronts. So I made this super helpful template for attaching all of the hardware, since I wanted to make sure each piece of hardware was centered for each quote-unquote drawer of the Apothecary cabinet, and that they'd be centered down each drawer of the cabinet. So for the template, I marked the center of the board and lined up my hardware and pre-drilled holes. That way I just have to mark the center of each drawer box, quote unquote, and line it up with my template. So much easier than marking the location of each hole and hoping you don't make a mistake. I was so excited when I thought of this hack, and I am sure it saved me a couple of hours of time, honestly. Once I pre-drilled the holes, I marked where I could nail the drawer front to the cabinet so I wouldn't have to wood fill it and paint it later on. I'd hold the drawer front in place and use some index cards as shims before securing it to the front and then drilling it in place through the drawer box. I did that for each drawer, but didn't want to show you so I don't spoil this gorgeous reveal. Let me introduce you guys to my DIY apothecary cabinet. I am absolutely amazed with how this cabinet turned out. I am obsessed with it. It has changed my whole office to have this amazing storage piece for organization, and even though it looks like an apothecary cabinet with separate drawers, I get to enjoy the full space of a full drawer. It was great to see this $30 dresser turn into this beautiful apothecary cabinet with just a little bit of paint and a little bit of hard work. What an epic addition to my home office. As always, I'll leave links to everything that I use down in the description below, and if you want more tips and tricks on how I put this whole thing together, you can check it out on my website, which I've also got down below. So what do you guys think of this furniture flip? Let me know down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this apothecary cabinet flip, I'd appreciate it if you gave this video a like and shared it with your friends. And if you want to see more DIY and furniture builds, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the bell so that you don't miss any future videos. I will see you guys for the next project. You're not going to want to miss it. Bye!